Hi, my name is Benedict for Higher Hertz. Today's video is looking at the Vital Spectral Warping Wavetable Synth. My 10 most used VST list did raise a couple of howls of protest as to how come I could not have chosen Vital. Remember, that was what I use. There have been reasons I haven't used Vital, and none of them suggest that it's actually a bad synth. It's what I use. If you use it and I don't, that doesn't mean that there's any kind of personal insult. It just means that there's a reason why I use something else more. One of the reasons that Vital didn't 100% grab me when I first got it, and I got it when it first came out, and that has been part of the problem, is that there were a couple of little bugs. So it wasn't as reliable for me to use, and after that, it didn't get used a lot. It's not to say I didn't use it, and I would never use it, so there's nothing wrong with it. It just was a case of, well, I had to make a decision. I did discuss that in the video, however, because the video was super long, I had to go through pretty aggressively, and it ended up on the cutting room floor. Who is Vital? Vital is Vital. They have a history, and I'll show you that in a moment. When you go to look up Vital on Google, you end up with this, and you end up on their webpage, you have a look and you scroll down and you look at the stuff, and eventually you'll come to the Get Vital stuff. And as you see, if you just want to get the basic engine, it is free, as in there is no cost to get the engine, and the engine's what we'll be looking at here. If you want to get the extra content, which is extra presets and more wavetables to feed it with, then you're going to need to pony up. We're going to focus on the engine because to me that's the important stuff. As a synthesist myself, I just don't use presets. Very, very fair pricing. The model, however, is built around, we'll give you the bare bones, and if you don't happen to be a fully experienced synthesist like myself, then you may suddenly find that you're going back to buy stuff. And that's okay, because you can obviously opt in as to how committed you want to be, what you want to get. Now, the history that I mentioned before is Mark Tytel. His former synth was called Helm, again a freebie, and you can still get this little fella. Helm now is possibly not necessary. However, it's a simpler looking synth. Everything's on the one screen. So if you look at what we're looking at here and go, oh gee, I like the sound, but I think I'm a little overdone by the knobs and buttons and how to move around this thing, you might consider getting Helm instead to Vital. Just a little bit of housekeeping. The only thing that you're going to hear extra is a tiny bit of soft tube saturation knob. This is Vital. When you open it, it is pretty big. You do have options to resize this fella up to, well, stupid size, but that stupid size is probably working on the assumption that I had 4K, which I do not. If you're not fairly well versed in synthesis, you could well feel a little overawed at this moment. If you just go with the bit you get and then gradually allow that to grow, then you'll find you do far easier than looking at this going, I don't understand what all these things are, because you don't need to. We've got 1, 2, 3 oscillators, but 3 of these oscillators are exactly the same as each other. Therefore, you don't need to learn 3 oscillators, you just need to learn 1, and then over time, learn how to have 2 or more oscillators interact with each other. There's a 4th oscillator, which is a sample playing device. Pretty darn simple. Whack an audio sound into it, and it'll just keep playing it back at you. Simple as that. There are 2 filters, but again, the 2 filters are the same as each other. Some macros down the side. That's just a way of assigning this knob to do several things. If you don't need it, ignore them. Pitch and mod wheels, pretty standard stuff. Pitch makes sound go up and down. The mod wheel is just assignable. If you want something, say like vibrato, to come in and out as you're playing, and you'll see a mod wheel used a little bit later, that's all it is. That's all you need to know. The other stuff, you'll work it out as time goes by. So basic synthesizer, yep, sounds like a synth. Presets. There are some presets in here. Well, if we just look at all, that's your your lot there. Some nice sounds, some really nice sounds actually, but they're not going to give you a basic set of sounds to do kind of whatever. And of course that's going to be deliberate because they want you to buy sounds. What the sounds are that you would buy, I really don't know. I have made some sounds over the last couple of days to learn a bit more about how the synth works and to be able to explain some of the fancier features. This is not going to be a complete tutorial on how to use this synth. There's probably plenty more on those. It's just going to be showing you broadly how things work. So let's go with some of the presets that I've made. They're just in the order in which they've ended up. So we can choose it and then close the preset chooser. A kind of electric piano, but it's not a Rhodes or a Whirly. It's a very digital synth electric piano kind of thing. So if we were to have to tie it down to a model, then we'd be thinking something maybe DX7, probably a little bit more like Casio CZ1000 sort of sound, or even the VZ type sound, which was a bit of both. What we've got is we've got a single oscillator. We've got 16-part unison. That really fills the sound out. We've got some effects, a delay. That's just adding a little bit more body and warmth to the sound. It's not a noticeable effect in the situation. And a little bit of modulation, which we'll get to later. Now you'll see that every time I play a note, this waveform changes shape. And that's being done through modulation. There are lots of modulation sources, and you can generally pick them because see how when I hover over that, it has a funny looking little icon? That's like a jack icon. Or it's their idea of a jack icon. So we can drag that. Let's just open up something we're not using. We can drag this over to something else. Let's say we want to modify this knob here. Then we can assign that amount to this knob. Brilliant. And then if we don't want that anymore, we can just right click and remove it. Again, this isn't supposed to be a tutorial, but I'm just showing you how it works, how it thinks, so that you can follow with this. Now this oscillator, I have assigned random, which means that every time I press a note, it just picks a number between 1 and whatever. And we've assigned that to oscillator 1 frequency morph amount, which is this doohickey here. Now, the underpinning of this synthesizer is 100% digital. It is a spectral or an additive synth at heart, which means that everything's done in the digital domain. There's no sense of, until we get into filters, which we'll turn off for the moment, this waveform is just being calculated with zeros and ones and some operators and ands and cosines and tans and what have you. Don't let that turn you off. That's just what's happening. And then we've got ways of controlling it. And in this case, I've used a digital mathematical low pass to change the timbre of this oscillator. So even though it's named like a filter, it's not going to behave like a filter. So you get that changing digital waveform sound, which you get with FM or Casio's phase distortion style of sound. And it's random, so every time we press a note, we get a different result. I've narrowed that range down so it's not too great. You'll see that the sleeve here shows that we're only using that much range. Otherwise it just gets too wild, too random. It's messy. Velocity is going to the overall level. You can see here. That's just to allow it to go from soft to hard. And this is an odd one. This modulation form actually means that it works over 1 octave on your physical keyboard and it just detunes across the octave, and then it starts again when you get to the next octave. And if you're listening closely, you'll notice that each note seems to be slightly different or out of tune from the others. Because the change is not great, you kind of don't notice it. If we make that amount a lot larger and try this at home, then we will find that we get serious off-pitching. But that softens the rigidity of the digital sound and makes it feel warmer. It's a tiny, tiny move there. And that's really everything that makes this sound. Unison in Vital is quite nice. There's a fair amount of versatility to it. There are some things they've put an awful lot of thought into, and this is one of them. If we move into advanced mode, we can see that for this oscillator, we can control unisons and has the stereo spreads and all of that. And that's pretty cool. So we can go from all on top of each other to stupid wide. Very much a slow sound. It's a long form sound, played a lot faster than you probably would sequence it. We've got just a couple of very basic sine waves. Now they're the most boring of sounds, but they're probably the most versatile of sounds, especially in the digital domain, because you can do stuff to them. So we've got our level, we've repitched them. There's an FM, so we're FMing oscillator 2 to oscillator 1. That's where we're getting that little bit of grind from. And then we can hear that get turned. Actually, no, it's the smear on the other side, sorry, the smear that gets turned up. So that's you can see the modulation there. There are various waveform distortions. Before you start thinking Slash from Guns N' Roses distortion, no, these are morphing, moving things around, warping distortions. And so you can change the way the waveform looks. So you'll see this upper waveform gets messed up, distorted, as we raise that mod wheel. So that's the mod wheel moving this. So we can see the assignment here, see the assignment here. And a little bit of FM. And that's got a random, which is this one here. So sample and hold, which just moves it. Because this is a sound that's likely to sit there for a very long time, it could sit there for 32 bars just holding a chord. In that time, you do not want the listener actually switching the sound off in their mind. So using something subtle like a little sample and hold random, that's changing the timbre of that sound ever so slightly all the time, which means that it's constantly being put back in front of the person's mind. So FM is doable. We've got quite a few choices, so we can FM oscillators 2 and 3 to oscillator 1. You can't FM an oscillator 2 itself, normal enough. You can also FM the sample to an oscillator, which is pretty cool. We'll see that later. Ring modulation as well. You can ring modulate oscillators to each other. We've got the portamento, so very long portamento. You notice there as we move from note or chord to chord, you can change the slope of that. So as it travels from one to another, you can change the shape of that travel from flat to concave or convex, and just a couple of different glide modes. That's nice. That actually works very nicely in this situation. This one's using our sample oscillator. Let's just go turn these effects off for the moment. A global effect on and off would be nice, it really would. And it's going through these filters. That's the sample, one I had lying around, and we've got it so that it bounces backwards and forwards. You can see the reed. And it's tied to the keyboard. And then it's going through a comb filter, which is a high-low flange, because there are a lot of filter shapes in here. Analog, dirty analog, ladder, which is a Moog style filter, digital filters, diode filters, which is a TB303 filter. They don't sound that good outside of a TB303. Formants, combs, and phasers. A lot of filter shapes, and generally pretty darn useful. You can choose what's being assigned to each filter. And then our second filter is taking what filter one is doing. So that's softening the sound up. And as we go into the effects, a little bit of delay. You see there's a lot of movement on this. This is again a random, it's a Flowen Noise shape, so it's a soft, wandery kind of a noise, and that's assigned to our time, so our delay time, which makes it warp the pitch around. EQ took me a couple of goes to kind of get my head around how this EQ behaves, but we got there, and that's just pulling out the center of the sound to focus, you know, where the interesting stuff's happening. And then, of course, reverb. Now is probably as good a time as any to talk about the effects in general. We've got chorus, a compressor, which I gotta say I could never get my head around in any of the modes. Single band mode, whatever, I just felt like it made a mess. I didn't like the compressor at all. Sorry guys, don't like it. I've tried it a few times, can't get anything useful. The chorus is interesting, you can have up to 16 voices, and you'll see and hear that a few times. That's nice. Distortion, kind of cool. Definitely not bad. Reverb is okay. For an onboard, reverb is not too bad. Overall, I generally am not a big fan of inbuilt effects on synths. I think they rarely do justice, and by the time you get to making a mix, they're often causing you more damage than good. But because people have got this sound with all these effects on it, especially reverbs and delays, they kind of don't want to let go of them, and then often struggle with the mix. So don't feel like because they're there you have to use them. And if you're struggling with a mix, then go back in and have a look at, and particularly look at delays and reverbs, and probably turn them off, because you can probably do better outside the box than you will inside the box, and that's not vital. It's the same, it's in reason. I tend to turn them off more than on as well. What's being modulated, as we saw, was just a random to the delay frequency, and then an LFO. This LFO here says we can do stepped LFOs. Is being assigned to the rate. So you'll see that, and here, that noise, the modulation, is moving around, so it keeps it very unsettled, which is good. Groovy Graveyard. sort of at heart an electric piano, but also sounds like a real kooky little Moog sound from a 60s or 70s horror movie. Really quite a charming little sound. Very simple sine wave, and then we've got envelope 2 that's sending modulation 1 amount, which is actually this. So we've got this LFO oscillator up into a key tracked mode, so you can actually have it so that it changes rate and basically becomes a kind of an audio oscillator, and then that is assigned to, let's have a look at my matrix, LFO 1 to oscillator 1, and a little bit of movement which is brought in from this. But we don't want too much because it sounds horrible. A lot of the interest comes from that there is a delay between the beginning of the note. See, envelope 1 starts straight away, and this has a little bit of a delay. So that gives you that double hit and the little bit of coarse FM. So this is not the same FM as a DX7. This is quite literally using one oscillator to change the pitch of another oscillator. And it gives you a coarse sound, which is not particularly charming. This one's a big sound. It's really getting into that. This is a big synth. Let's pull out lots of stuff. So a fair amount of the sound is coming through the effects. So let's just turn them all off. Phaser. We'll leave that out for the moment. EQ just goosing the sound a little. Chorus. That's where the chorus is nice, does a nice job there. Delay. That's really interacting more with the chorus, just giving us a little bit more movement. And the reverb. I don't love the reverb, but it does sit in okay. The way the sound is put together. First oscillator. The level modulation is just for our velocity, and that is a frustration I have with this. There isn't one place in which you can create a simple velocity to the whole patch. If you do it to here, to the main master volume, which I remember when I first got the synth, I spent hours trying to find this. I think someone had to tell me where it was because it's a little obtuse. But if you send velocity to here, this is a global, whereas velocity is per voice. So you press a note light here, and it sets the volume kind of low, and then you press a heavy note, and it brings up the volume of your first note. So it just takes whatever was the last thing that it was told, and that's not right. So short of getting into using a macro to control level and then using your velocity to control a macro, it is just like, guys, couldn't you have just given us some kind of a gain knob which was based around sort of the voicing, so that we can just build an easy velocity to volume level? That would have been nice. But we've got our oscillator. We're using a couple of these wave warping things to change the wave. Some will have a pretty strong pronounced sense of color. some not so much. So that seems to be all the stuff there. The second oscillator. A couple of controls on our level. Ah yes, this is like a sub-oscillator. So it's a lot quieter, but it rises up in the mix. So you just feel this sense of majesty rise and then get out of the way. Not a big fan of sub-oscillators on things because they just tend to sound like you've got 2 octaves running at once. And it's just a personal thing. I don't love them. But in a situation like this, easy to control the level of the second one, which is here, envelope 2. It's a slow envelope. And that just gives us a nice kind of swell. The envelopes are pretty cool. You've got to get your head around the resizing. They're essentially a kind of multi-segment display, even though they are locked into essentially an ADSR with a delay and a hold in the middle. But they work nicely, and I do like that you've got this shaping. So we can shape how our sections work. And that is nice. The way an envelope speaks from place to place has a real impact on the way the sound feels. So that's controlling both our filter and the level of this second oscillator. Third oscillator is pretty slow to come in. Its level is controlled by velocity, and envelope 3, which is this one here. You see there's fair delay, and we've got a concave. So it's quite slow for that sound to come in. We don't want it there straight away. So we want the main sound, that sort of Vangelis Blade Runner-y kind of feel, to come in, and then the tingles as it sits there so that it doesn't become a dead dog. Only one of them has a little bit of unison, pretty standard stuff. The random LFO is how we're getting the tinkly tinklies. If we were to turn that off, which is random 1, not so exciting. Let's put all our voice back in. Tinkly, tinkly. So if you want to audition something without some kind of routing, then you can mute it here. A pair of filters, so just an analog style, 24 dB low pass, and then with oscillator 3 is this guy. The ability to reshape these filters on the fly and morph them is pretty cool. And as you see, everything responds to Control Z, which is good because some VST don't. So the ability to morph most of the filters from one shape to another is really rather nice. It's on the digital side, but you can get the right sound as a result of it, so that's a good thing. Similar, here we're using the drive, so we'll kill off these other effects. A little bit of folding just gives us a slightly crunchy, slightly unsettling edge to things. But being quite digital, they can go straight into nasty territory, which is a lot of what people want, especially if they're doing the paint strippery kind of thing. Chorus here, making a big difference, you know, really bulking up the sound. Like most drives, it's very dependent upon input level. So this is not a per voice drive, it's a global drive. So these effects are after the voice has all been put together, like all the notes have been put together, then they go through these effects. Pretty standard stuff. There are a few synths that will give you effects that are fully in the voice path. So sounds. Again, very simple. That drive is working on it. What is this? Where'd this come? Oh, this is affecting something else. Oscillator 3 is in the game, but it's being FM'd from the sample, which is here. So that's our sample there. FM from a sample is normally horrid, but if you're careful with how far you wind the knob, you can get nice results, especially in this sort of thing, because you get movement different from a standard oscillator, because invariably your sample is different from an oscillator, although this is an oscillator sample. You can choose how you view different ways. I tend to stick with the 2D thing, but if you're big on the wavetable thing, then the 3D plots are kind of cool, I guess. That's a collection of sounds, oscillators interacting with each other, and a straight 24 dB to get rid of that nasty kind of sound. But I've deliberately used a digital filter there that doesn't claim to do anything other than the pure maths, because it's a digital sound, so I don't want to roll any of that off, so to speak. I think we've sort of seen most of what's going on there. Envelope 3 is sent to envelope 3 is sent to the tuning of the sample. So our sample is going out of tune, which is affecting the FM and the drive a little bit. So it makes for a really nice background wash inside something, and Vital proves itself to be really rather nice for that. It's not a strident sound. That can be a liability, which I'll talk about later, but it's never a strident sound. Maybe if you are doing the paint stripper thing, maybe it gets very aggressive there, but in terms of for nice sounds, not so much at all. This is a basic form of physical modelling that the synth is able to deliver on. Not with as much detail as a fully dedicated physical module synth, but physical modelling is a bit of a funny one and rarely delivers what you hope. So here it's a sample, which is one of the inbuilt samples, and I've got my own samples here. You just show it a folder and then it remembers it. Nice of it. And that's one of the inbuilt samples, and just a very short attack. And where is it? Level here. You see, very short. And that's triggering this comb filter. Set that to a full key track. As you see, the sound isn't key tracked. And we can set our basic timbre, but we do need to set resonance incredibly high. And then just a little bit of So you can get kind of nylon or steel acoustic guitar type thing. Probably with a little bit of care, you can get a little bit of a violin-y sort of thing as well. I didn't put the time in for this. I have done very similar in Europa and got some really nice results. And then, because you can have some little issues with fundamental pitching, then adding in an oscillator. Most often you just add in a little bit of sine wave to reinforce your fundamental, to hold your fundamental, so your instrument feels well tuned. In this case, I went for a slightly more interesting sound. Or let's move to all the black keys. Instant Asian music. I'm sure there's more to it than that, but it's that feel that we get. I use synth strings, synth pad strings, and what have you all the time. So it's a thing that I want out of an instrument. I don't think I've ever got exactly what I want out of this, but you can get nice sounds. I would be doing something else to that within the mix, probably a low pass filter or something just to get that right. But it's quite a nice sound. And most of that is coming from the oscillators. Without using heavy unisons, if we just go to the... That's just pulling out the high mids. It's nice, but for some reason there's just a politeness. It just doesn't quite move right, and I don't know why. But with a little bit of unison, if I got into pulse width modulation or something like that, then we'd get a little bit more movement. But I tend to really love saw bass strengths rather than PWM strings. But it does deliver a nice sound with, well, not an awful lot of work going on. There's a bit of white noise in there. Kind of not super noticeable, but it does help spark a sound up. So in the right situation, good notes, good mixing, and the right kind of processing, EQing and what have you within the mix, that would do a very, very nice job. That's the important thing to me, not how amazing is this sound on its own, but how's it going to work in a mix. That's gotten us to the end of this list of sounds that I've made. Pretty long, yes, but you've seen most of the capabilities of the instruments without getting into heavy technical kind of stuff. You'll work that out as you go, or if you don't know it yet, it's not relevant for me to talk about. So that brings us now to the good and bad of the synth according to me. And that is, the good is that it's very versatile. You've got a big architecture that once you understand it and how it comes together, and great that it doesn't have whatever kooky little bugs that it had when I first tried it, there's a lot that you can do, but you are going to need to understand synthesis more than just, grabbing something like a Juno 106 type thing and going, yeah, I'm a synthesist. This gets pretty darn deep. The sound is very smooth, and in many ways that's really rather good to have a nice smooth sound. The downside is that it can sound just a bit too polite. And where I'm looking for a sound that has character, that pulls people in, I struggle in a mix often to feel like that's kind of giving me that. However, not every mix should have 110% balls to the wall kind of sounds. So those more polite, let's sit in the background sounds can be really, really good in a mix. There's nothing worse than being sent a mix full of sounds and every single one of them is fighting to be emperor. You're going to struggle to get that mix to behave properly. So there's your hero, and then the guys who are backing the hero up. And this seems to do quite a nice job there. Again, if you're getting into the paint stripper thing, that smooth sound could well get nasty, and that's probably exactly what you're looking for. You can get quite detailed sounds from it, and that is nice. The negative side of that is that, again, because the sounds feel quite smooth, they feel smoothed off, then sometimes that makes me feel like the sounds don't have those little hooks to get into you. One thing I did notice, and I haven't, because I'm not using this here in the real world, and it's only in a real mix where you really sort of make those decisions, is that I think oversampling's been on. And often I think synths are nicer when the oversampling is off, especially digital synths. People will howl and go, oh, but you'll have aliasing and that's not right, man. But having grown up with my first synths being hardcore digital synths like the Casio CZ, well, they alias like a bastard. And that's part of their charm. I was stunned when I first really spent some time with a virus, and the virus was like virus, everything, everywhere. If you didn't own a virus, you must be a loser. And got this thing, headphones on, and I'm like, oh my god, this aliases terribly. That was one noisy aliased synth. And that was part of why people loved it so much. So possibly the sound can be a little too polite, can be overcome by remembering to go into advanced and turning off the oversampling. It might be as simple as that. So good overall. We've covered most of the bads. We've covered the fact that I think the effects, like most onboard effects in most synths, they're just a little odd. Another thing that I find frustrating is that some conventions are not followed, and I don't see why they're not followed. I'm all for breaking a convention if we're going to end up with something better, but things like LFOs are based on seconds. Who does that? It's odd. LFOs are traditionally done on hertz because that's related to oscillators. So the speed of LFOs and controlling and setting your speeds is just kind of weird because you're being asked to learn something different. I don't mind learning something different at all if I feel like, ooh, that's opened a door. But to me, it doesn't feel like it opens a door at all. It feels like unnecessary confusion. I put that down to the assumption that the people who are going to use this synth are only looking to make and paint stripper sounds. And that's possibly part of why I haven't been as in love with it. Vital can feel like it's very targeted to a certain type of person. Now, to be perfectly honest, I reckon it was targeted to a certain type of person. I reckon it was targeted to people who were using or wishing they could use Serum. But for whatever reason, either had gotten bored with the presets in Serum or felt like they couldn't afford Serum. So here you could get the thing free and then you have to buy a whole pile of presets to make yourself feel Serum-y. And that's okay, but that to me smells more like marketing than instrument building. But as a sound that can be used in a mix, yes, Vital has been used in my mixes and probably will again. 95% of the time where it's grabbed or more, it makes it to the mix, it makes it to the album. So it's a fine synth. Might take you a little bit to learn, but once you get there, there's really quite a lot you could do with it. You can build your sound around the instrument, but unless you're buying presets, it will require you to really improve your skills as a synthesist. Again, my name is Benedict for Higher Hertz. If you have any general questions, please don't ask me to troubleshoot the synth. Ask them down below. Also, if you could hit the subscribe button, maybe even pop it over to higherhertz.com and subscribe yourself. That way you stay up to date with our reviews and information as we come through. You have a great day now.